So before we get started, I have a fun announcement to make. I am going to be at Gen Con August 17th through the 20th in Indianapolis. I'm going to be running games for the Wrecking Crew, so if any of you want to find me, say hello, come by the Wrecking Crew area. I'm going to be there basically all day on Thursday. I'm going to be there in the evening on Friday, and I'm going to be there in the morning and evening on Saturday. Sunday I have off. I'll just be wandering around the vendor area doing whatever. I'm going to bring a whole bunch of packets of the Arcadia card game that was based off of Changeling back in the day. I recently picked those up. We're eventually going to be looking at it. But if any of you see me, want to say hi, I'll be handing those out to anyone who's a listener of the podcast. Come by the Wrecking Crew area, see what's going on. A lot of other people are going to be running a lot of games, and I hope to talk to some of you while I'm there. Welcome back to Walking Away from Arcadia. We did an episode recently on the Commoners. Now, when I say recently, I mean we posted it recently. We actually recorded it several months ago before C20 dropped, when we were initially putting together our plan for episodes in order. Changeling 20th was released, and a couple other things happened, and our whole order and structure got thrown to the winds. My co-host Simon and I talked about it, and now that there are some new commoner kith included in core Arcadian society, as opposed to trying to go back and hack at that already fairly long episode, we decided we wanted to do a little mini episode that just talked about the new kith. They aren't brand new. They were in the game before, but they were kind of fringe sourcebook Ghislaine, and now they are central to Arcadian society. So welcome to the show and our ponderings on the Piskies, the Clurichauns, and the Selkies. And I'm here, of course, with my co-host, Simon Eichhorchen.
And these are all now commoner kith. They're part of the Kithain society generally. They operate basically the same as everybody else. There's no strangeness with renaming things or with having completely different mechanics. So,
"Hey, Sweeney," said Shadow, breathless. "Why are we fighting?" "For the joy of it," said Sweeney, sober now, or at least no longer visibly drunk. "For the sheer unholy fucking delight of it. Can't you feel the joy in your veins rising up like the sap in the springtime?" His lip was bleeding. So was Shadow's knuckle. "So how'd you do the coin production?" asked Shadow. He swayed back and twisted, took a blow on his shoulder intended for his face. "To tell the truth," grunted Sweeney, "I told you how I did it when we first spoke. But there's none so blind—" Ow! Good one! "As those who will not listen." Shadow jabbed at Sweeney, forcing him back onto a table. Empty glasses and ashtrays crashed to the floor. Shadow could have finished him off then. The man was defenseless, in no position to be able to do anything, sprawled back as he was. Shadow looked down at Mad Sweeney. "Are we done?" he asked. Mad Sweeney hesitated, then nodded. Shadow let go of him and took several steps backward. Sweeney, panting, pushed himself back up to a standing position. "Not on your ass," he shouted. "It ain't over till I say it is." Then he grinned and threw himself forward, swinging at Shadow. He stepped onto a fallen ice cube, and his grin turned to open-mouthed dismay as his feet went out from under him and he fell backward. The back of his head hit the barroom floor with a definite thud. Shadow put his knee into Mad Sweeney's chest. "For the second time, are we done fighting?" "Well, we may as well be at that," said Sweeney, raising his head from the floor. "For the joy's gone out of me now, like the pee from a small boy in a swimming pool on a hot day." And he spat the blood from his mouth and closed his eyes and began to snore in deep and magnificent snores. So the Clurichaun in second edition were really straight out of the source myth. And the Clurichaun source myth is they are drunk leprechauns. It's not that leprechauns are generally drunk. It is that the Clurichaun are very specifically this group of leprechaun-like fae who have a perpetual drinking problem. They were, a lot of times they were house spirits, but they were house spirits for people who had wine cellars, who had large stores of alcohol. So, when you think about brownies or bogarts and, things went missing, they messed things up. If you were wealthy enough to have a wine cellar, and wine was certainly very important, especially because, although probably less so in Ireland than other parts of Europe, water was not always trustworthy in a pre-industrial world. So wine that had been fermented was much more safe, same with beer. And so if you had wine, it was important. And if wine disappears, who do you blame it on? You blame it on the Clurichaun. I found a little bit of writing that talked about how some Irish people viewed the Clurichaun as leprechauns that were just on a bender. Some people viewed the Clurichaun as a particularly different sort of leprechaun that had gone round the bend and was all about alcohol. But that's really the root of the Clurichaun myth, is about being a drunkard and a leprechaun at the same time. The original Clurichaun write-up was in the Immortal Eyes Court of All Kings book, and really emphasized that kind of drunken aspect. And it did some other things where, when drunk, they got into weird moods and it was their frailty. It was a really good reflection of the source myth. It wasn't a terribly playable kith, if I'm going to be really honest. I read them and I would not have wanted to play them. In C20, they updated them, and I'd like to say they turned them into general leprechauns. If I'm going to be honest, they really didn't. General leprechauns are a very particular take on the house spirit and have a lot in common with boggans or bogarts. Leprechauns, if anything, were kind of nicer versions of bogarts in a lot of myths, in that they would work on shoes. That's where a lot of that myth came from. They were industrious. The Clurichaun, as they're written in C20, are kind of a Neil Gaiman Mad Sweeney ripoff. They're brawlers, they like getting into a good fight, they can read a situation, they have hordes of something that they collect. The mythology nut in me isn't super thrilled by that. The role player in me kind of loves them. So it's kind of a wash. I would totally play one. They would be incredibly entertaining. They're tricksters. They like a good fight. They manipulate a situation. And they're written up as the kind of fellow that knows exactly how to provoke that Zen Buddhist into a fight. And then once you've just pounded each other to a pulp, is going to be laughing with them and saying wonderful things and buying them a pint. I mean, they're that guy that you love but are super frustrated about because he's, makes every night into a catastrophe. And in a role-playing game, who doesn't love kind of playing that?
Can't think of a D&D game I've played that didn't end one night with, and the bar burned down and you have been chased out of town.
Yeah, that's really the Clurichaun that does that. The thing about the Clurichaun that I'm a little weird on is they're a really localized fae, which is part of why they were Ghislaine before, despite being Celtic. There isn't really a version of this myth in a bunch of different cultures and a bunch of different places in the world. They aren't like the Slua or more generic house spirits. In fact, the house spirit aspect of the leprechaun is more or less missing from the Clurichaun. That's boggin in our changeling world. So they're super duper tied to Ireland. And it does say, well, some of them moved over to America with the Irish. Cool. But I can't imagine running a Changeling the Dreaming game in, say, Italy and having a Clurichaun there. And so being yes, these are absolutely central to Arcadian society, we swear, is a little weird for me.
Well, they probably hang out with the troll soccer mom a little.
Oh, I love the troll soccer mom so much. She's fantastic.
Yeah, I love the troll soccer mom, and I see her hanging out with the Clurichaun and being that person who keeps them around because they love them, but are intensely frustrated with them at the same time.
Oh yeah, like this whole relationship is playing out in my mind. I can sometimes get lost in the details of like, does this make sense? Is this cosmologically consistent? The Clurichaun, to be totally honest, kind of don't meet any of that stuff, but I'm still glad they're core kith. I think it fleshes the game out more. Also just speaking more generically about these new commoner kith, I think some of what they did in C20 was to say, hey, every other game has like 13 core groups. Mage is the only game that doesn't, but now that the technocracy are sort of seen as equal playable groups, now they really do. They have like this nice round 13 core groups. Changeling has 1,000,001 she houses, but really, if you're not super into the she, you're left with not as many options as everyone else has. And so I think that's part of why they added a few more commoner kith, and I think it's a good change.
Yeah, and I think these new commoner kiths, like individually, they fill an interesting role if you're willing to expand them just a teeny bit. The Piskie and the Selkie a little bit more obviously because one is intensely tied to the sky and wind, and the other is intensely tied to the sea and water. And the Clurichaun, they only take a little bit of golden ruling to push them back towards their source material and get them a little bit more closely tied to growing things and wood, because that's where alcohol comes from usually. And each of these new commoner kiths occupies a space in between Kithain society and an anime kingdom, which is a place the game could have always used a little bit more development, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll get into that connection, I'm sure, a little bit more when we talk about the Piskies and the Selkies, but with the Clurichaun, we were talking about if you do make them about alcohol, which not everybody is going to want to do for reasons related to the real world, but if you maybe just like cheat back that way and don't go all the way to their original write-up, then you can give them this relationship with shaped dryad in anime, who are the dryads of wine vines, or the dryads of the peat moss that gets made into scotch, if you want to go that direction and go a little bit outside of Ireland and into Scotland. There are a lot of possibilities there, and they would have really interesting relationships with all of those spirits. There's also, to get outside of World of Darkness and into some territory that most people would probably think of as a little more mage, there are some interesting books written on the spirit and personality of like all plants. Mostly it's written with an angle on sort of old hearth pharmacology. So the idea of the aspects of plants and what they do to people, mixed spiritual drug, lens, and then there's some written that's more modern drug culture lens. And whether or not you take stock in any of that, just as sort of inspirational source material, looking at it in slightly less technical ways than it's written about what sort of an anime would grow out of these plants, and that so much of this is turned into drugs, is turned into alcoholic beverage of one form or another, and that alcohol and the way we drink it is central to a lot of cultures. You could do some really interesting tie-ins if you expand on the personality aspects of especially shaped dryads.
The other tie that the Clurichaun provides that I think is helpful is we were just talking about how they fit in with a certain type of troll. They also fit in with a certain type of redcap, and getting into the homemaking aspects of what you do with alcohol. You get Boggins in there, you get Satyr in there. I don't think most people would play a Clurichaun that would be the heart of a group, but the potential's in there, and they occupy a potentially very diplomatic place in the society the game makes.
Yeah, I definitely agree. When I was looking up on the original Clurichaun myths, I actually found, article is maybe a strong term, but a write-up looking at some writings by Yeats and some other people who were trying to unravel these Irish myths. And there are certain people that were like, Leprechaun, Clurichaun, Redcap are they really different spirits, or is it all just the same spirit in a different mood? And they didn't specifically use the term red cap, but they described a leprechaun-like creature with a red cap on that, goes on the same sorts of benders as the Clurichauns, but they're more, what was the term that it used? It wasn't violent, it was visceral or something like that, implying the eating of people. And I just went, seeing all of these myths and seeing reference to, people living in the culture of these myths, sort of intermingling these particular ones was interesting. I just read it this morning in preparation for this episode, so it hasn't totally percolated in my head, but I feel like it's going to turn into something.
Oh, I love me some Yates. He's another person I think would probably keep the Clurichaun around, but not spend too much time with him.
Oh, that's so true.
A small village boy wandered out to pick flowers not far from his parents' cottage. His mother, looking from the kitchen window, saw him happily engaged in his innocent amusement, and then turned to make ready the evening's supper. When a few minutes later she went to call her boy in to his evening meal, he had vanished. His mother grew alarmed and went in search of him. For 2 days she and her husband sought high and low for the missing child, and then, on the morning of the 3rd day, to their delight, they found him sleeping peacefully on a bed of fern within a few yards of their cottage. He was perfectly well, quite happy, and entirely ignorant of the length of time that had elapsed. He told his parents that while picking flowers he had heard a bird singing in more beautiful tones than any he had heard before. Thus he was lured onward into the wood until he noticed that night had fallen, but the sky was ablaze with huge stars. Then more stars rose up all around him, and looking he saw that each was in reality a Piskie. These small people formed themselves into a procession, singing strange, fascinating songs, and under the leadership of one who was more brilliant and more beautiful than the rest, they led the boy through their dwelling place. This, he said, was like a palace. Crystal pillars supported arches hung with jewels which glistened in every color of the rainbow. Far more wonderful, the child said, were the crystals than any he had seen in a Cornish mine. The Piskies were kind to him, and seemed to enjoy his wonder and astonishment at their gorgeous cave. They gave him a fairy meal of the purest honey spread on dainty little cakes, and when at last he grew tired, numbers of the small folk fell to work to build him a bed of fern. Then, crowding around him, they sang him to sleep with a strange, soothing lullaby, which for the rest of his life he was always just on the point of remembering, but which as certainly escaped him.
The next kith we're going to talk about is a kith that changed pretty dramatically between the original write-up and C20, and that's the Piskie. So the original Piskie write-up is kind of too boring to describe. They were super nice guy fairy. Like, you could imagine a whole nice guy fairy meme designed around the Piskie, and that was honestly kind of their entire thing. There isn't much more to describe in this write-up, whereas in C20, they were given this really interesting ability in that they can literally shape change, but they don't do it intentionally. They do it as kind of a passive cultural thing. They will automatically grow to look like and sort of be like and take on the markers of whatever group of people they engage with, and almost no one ever sees their real face. So you could befriend a Piskie, they get in on your circle, your social context, they end up fitting in exactly because that's what they do, and then they move on. They're sort of traveling capricious fae. They like moving around, which also puts them in an interesting role of making social connections between groups of fae. If you run into that same Piskie 2 years later, and they've integrated with a totally different group of people, you might not even recognize them, because now they've changed the way they look to match this new social context. It doesn't match the source myth at all. Piskie is just the Cornish word for pixie. Piskies show up in Cornish myth. It kind of fits the nice guy fairy original write-up. The original write-up, as uninteresting as it was, really actually captured them very nicely. Of all the myths about the Fae I've ever read, the Pisky myths I found from Cornwall were the nicest. Now, they have a Thalain equivalent, and those also have root in Cornish mythology. Spriggans, who are basically Piskies who are assholes. That's really the long and the short of that. They kidnap kids. Piskies also kidnap kids, but Piskies kidnap neglected, abused kids and then return them after a few days of running around in fairy. Because why not go on a vacation? Your life sucks. Spriggans kidnap well-to-do kids and are jerks to them because they just like being assholes. And that's kind of all there is to Spriggans. It's weird. I really like the changes. I couldn't find any connection to source myth with the Piskies, but the source myth is, yay, it's another word for fairy, but we're going to turn it into a kith. What do we do with that? Whereas they've become this interesting social chameleon. It has some nice like espionage implications, which in the politics of the Fae is a really amazing place. I could see a Pisky loyal to a particularly cunning she-lord being a fascinating antagonist. They're like the perfect face for a standard RPG group. They're kind of fun.
My familiarity with the Pisky myth is mostly that they are the spirits of dead people that possess particular animals, usually seagulls or seals, and C20 did not go in that direction with them. But reading their write-up for C20, the two things that leapt immediately to my mind reading the C20 write-up for the Piskies were Peter Pan, because that's kind of what they are, and Sparrow from Bone Dance by Emma Bull, which is a post-apocalyptic techno-fantasy novel. And particularly with Sparrow, they were written as this character that everybody kind of liked, but nobody got particularly close to because they kept people kind of a step away from them for character reasons described later. But it came to light at one point in the book, skip ahead about 30 seconds if you are reading that book, that Sparrow was designed as a clone meant to be androgynous and capable of fitting into any social situation because there was this technological phenomenon in this world known as, the Riders of the Apocalypse or something like that, who are basically Loa. They ride people and use them as the perfect spies. They just take possession of a person, then move on with the information they gained. And so Sparrow and their type of clone were designed to be the perfect host for a rider because they could instinctually mimic other people's appearances and mannerisms. So they were very comfortable to ride. And that's what the Pisky looks like to me. Again, they occupy an interesting space in the society of the game because they have that tie to the sky and the wind, which gives them a leg up dealing with the inanimate air elementals, as well as having a fairly unique shtick in changelings broadly. There's one group of Nunahi who have a similar ability. I think it's the Nanahi. But the Nanahi change their appearance intentionally, where the Pisky just does it because they're kind of a chameleon. And the space they occupy gives them a bit of connecting tissue between them, the she, the Ishu, kind of the Puka. It would depend on the Puka and the Pisky, I think. But they could do that.
The Piskies are a little bit trickster, and the other big thing with Piskies that I forgot to mention is they're kleptos, which that does have roots in the source myth. They're known to be kleptos. If they see a thing that they want, they won't even be aware that they're stealing it. The Pisky isn't the sort of person who would pull off a heist. They're just the sort of person who sees a thing and goes, oh my god, that's beautiful, I have to have it. And then 5 minutes after they pick it up, they don't even remember that they took it. They just know they have this thing they want, which is very Fae. Like, it's very fairy. And so I kind of like that because I actually don't think any other commoners have that dynamic. And the brownie stealing things aspect of Fae myth is very strong. So having a commoner with that aspect is kind of nice. It fills in a pretty big hole. The only thing about the idea of the Piskie, and it's kind of something the Cluri can have as well, is it's an intensely localized term. It is Cornish for pixie, is really what it is. So, especially if you're playing with someone with cultural background that connects them to that, there is a certain amount of divorcing / letting them play around with terminology that would not be inappropriate.
"I'm not stopping," he said, shrugging off his skin like a wetsuit, then stretching it on the Bodhran's frame. "Let's play." And he played till dawn, all the jigs and reels he knew, before he stood and drained the last from his glass. He slipped back into the sealskin and into a new day, saluting us with that famous grin, "That's me away." And the last group that made its way into the commoner kiths are the Selkies. And a Selkie is a seal. The Selkies are unique among the Kithain because they're shapeshifters, but they can only shift into one form, and in C20, it's almost, but not quite, outright stated that they are their seal skin. When a Selkie reincarnates, it's because they've given the skin to someone else. It's not because they died. And so they have a really unique hook there, because they are very closely tied to the crafted in anime in that way. They are the spirits of an object, rather than a proper changeling being a fusion between a human soul and a Fae soul. They are, at the same time being that sort of a fusion, they're created very intentionally. And so, as seals, they occupy a place in the natural world that puts them on land and the sea, but much more the sea. It allows them to have an interesting overlap with both the water elementals and the Kithain, which is a place that was never particularly well developed, even though it really should have been for the game. And the Selkie myths are interesting. Selkies are sometimes beneficent and other times horrifically vengeful. The Selkie myth that I remember the best is the one about a farmer who catches a Selkie on the shore in her human form and steals her coat. So she can't return to the sea, she can't go home, and compels her, because with a stolen coat you can compel a Selkie into servitude, compels her to marry him, live on the farm with him, have children with him, and then eventually, when he's out taking care of something, she finds where he hid her coat, and she takes their now child-aged children with her to the sea, and when the farmer finds them, she's drowning them and beating them to death. And as he's chasing her down, she transforms into a seal and jumps into the sea, and he never sees her again, and his life is more or less destroyed. Her anger was pretty righteous in this case, but that ends up being a really core quality of Selkies in the mythology.
It does, and I really like that story because it has some of the Fae are capricious, and they do not do equitable payback. They do horrible, over-the-top payback. And you get this, okay, this isn't a good spirit, but at the same time, it's not a wantonly malignant spirit. And I like that ambiguity in fairy stories. I see a lot of people either Tinkerbell things, and like Disney Tinkerbell, not original literary Tinkerbell, because literary Tinkerbell was a bitch. She was heinous. I loved the description of why she was heinous. It was a great description.
Oh yeah, I loved that.
it was so good. I mean, just saying, well, you see, fairies are small and they only have enough space for one emotion at a time. So you don't ever want that emotion to be envy or anger. No, really. I love that.
Yeah, that made me really happy. Lots of things about Peter Pan made me really happy when I finally read it.
Yeah. But I see people either Disney Tinkerbell fairies or go the horrible alien other from beyond space and time angle with them. And I find both those narratives to be unfortunately simplistic. So I really like that Selkie story because it's messy. You know, similarly, when I was looking up Selkie myths, if you don't try to catch them, they are very amorous. They do seduce people. But if you accept the fact that they're just going to disappear when the sea calls them, and that's a little bit tragic, but you might get a brief period of wonderful love affair out of it, they're not going to rip your life apart. And they're not, as Fae go, they're actually pretty nice overall, just as with all Fae, really don't screw them over. The thing I find interesting about the Selkies in Changeling is there's this huge aspect to them, this power to transform. It's never been written up as a birthright, which jumped out at me as really weird in C20, and I reported it on the errata thread, and then I went back and read their original write-up. It's not written up there either. There's like one or two lines in the general flavor write-up that kind of describes how the sealskin works, but the sealskin is left as an ambiguous hanging pseudo-system, which is really weird.
Of the new commoner kiths, I think the Selkie is the one that's closest to its original source material. And I think that's partly because Selkie represents kind of that burning call some people have for the sea. I have a friend right now he grew up in Florida, and his family does a lot of fishing, and he goes out there every year to help them with that. And it's the middle of summer, it's not time for that. And even right now, you can tell he's kind of getting pulled over that way, even though it's not really... It's just... The ocean kind of gets its claws into you, and you can't get it out for some people. And the Selkie really speaks to that. And I think that's a human thing. I don't think that's a cultural thing.
I completely agree. About a month or so ago, I spent my first time really with any meaningful period of time in the sea, and I went snorkeling down in Florida Keys for the first time, and it's weird how alluring it is. And how much you could just go, yes, I could sit here, I could swim here, I could be in this ocean forever. It is absolutely true that the ocean kind of gets its hooks in you. The Selkies also aren't super culturally specific. It is a Celtic myth, but the myth of the Selkie also extends well up into Icelandic and Norwegian regions as well. And in a changeling context, when you look at how far and wide seals go, you could imagine the Selkie really not being regional at all. In C20, they are framed in the Menehune myth as finally showing up on Hawaii and telling the Menehune, hey, shit's getting real. This sundering, shattering thing is a problem. The Menehune being isolated on Hawaii basically go, I have no idea what you're talking about. You're silly. And I went and I thought, hey, I wonder if there are any seals that are native to Hawaii, because I tend to think of seals as being a cold water sort of region. There are completely native seals to Hawaii, and they are warm weather seals. And I just thought about that story, and I went, there would already be Selkies there. They may not be called Selkies, because that is a regional word, but they would absolutely be there. And yeah, I like the idea of them as a broader member of Kithain society. It's still a little weird for me in my head thinking this is a mainline kith, because I think because I grew up landlocked, yes, Selkies would be everywhere. On the other hand, Selkies would only be on coasts. So it's not like they make sense in every setting. And so that you can pick any of the defaults because WAD game. I still feel like Selkies have a little bit of a, not in this game, but they're awesome and they fill a really unique space, and I really, really like them.
just now, thinking of it, there's a really, really good game to be had with a Selkie, a Clurichaun, and a Piskie all on a boat, like as freight workers traveling around, because they're all sort of messenger type kith, and that would be the place they all come together.
That would be really cool. That would also create some really interesting overlap with the anime. And potentially, depending on where you are, you could tell a really compelling Menehune story without being totally rooted in Hawaii. That could be one place that this group goes to occasionally, and you could actually involve the Menehune, which can be a little difficult to do because they are written as so hyper-regional.
It gets back into a bit of a conversation we had a little while ago about building cross kith and cross larger group political organizations into the game. The Selkie, the Mer, the Makole, and the Menehune, and some of the Nunahi would have a really compelling reason to have close ties with each other. And even though the Selkie is now a core kith, I see the Selkie in that situation having much closer ties to the Nunahi, the Menehune, and the Inanime and the Mer than they would the Kithain, because, again, in World of Darkness, water elementals tend to be kind of terrifying and kind of more closely tied to the sea than they are to their splat mates.
Yeah, and that actually brings up an interesting mechanical piece that bringing new kith into the main Kithain family brings up. The Fey realm is weird in that first level you can use your arts on commoner kith. And then at second level you can use your arts on nobles. And then at third level you can use your arts on kith that aren't like you. It says Ghislaine. There's a little block of text before the realm write-up that says, of course, the Nunahi views Kithain as Ghislaine, and they would use the lower levels on other Nunahi. This should be relative to what you're playing. But what does that really mean? When you get into, so the Selkie situation. Okay, I'm a Boggin who has grown up and lived an industrious life in Indiana my entire life. I have never seen a sea fae, because while the human that has the seal skin could, in theory, fly to Indiana for a week or two, they're going to end up going back to the sea. In their original write-up, they actually had to immerse themselves in salt water, or they basically had a banality trigger. That was replaced with the weakness of the skin being destroyed, which is better because they still had that weakness in the original write-up that just wasn't listed as the frailty. So they kind of had a double frailty, which wasn't cool. But even without that hard systematic limitation, they're going to go back to the sea. They have to. And so is a Boggin from a landlocked area really not going to see them as Ghislaine? Conversely, a Selkie who spends all of her time roaming around in the sea and regularly interacts with Mer, or is a native to Hawaii and regularly sees the Menehune, are they really going to see them as Ghislaine? They haven't devoted the word count to creating a framework to really talk about familiar dreams and dreams that your story has been interwoven with. But I like that framework for the progression of the Fey realm a lot more than what's been written. And I would really let any player make a call that said, hey, here I can justify being close enough to these stories to treat them as non-Ghislaine. And I similarly might call out and say, I know that's technically Core 13 Kith now, but seriously, you've never seen one before. Let's be realistic about your backstory. You're going to need third level Fey to affect them. I think that makes the realm a little more vital, and I think it makes more sense.
Right. In our game, we golden ruled, especially Sovereign, but we golden ruled Fey into being linked to a background that we based off of, I think it was called Title in 2nd edition, but we genericked it out a little bit to be a little bit more like Changeling the Lost's mantle background. Mantle reflects your group membership in this group, and they used it for courts. There was another one that reflected goodwill from groups. You could only have one mantle, but you could have many goodwills. We folded both of those things together into status, and status reflects both group membership and group goodwill. So you can have a primary status, which is your group membership, your cultural attachments, so Seelie Court, Unseelie Court, Nunahi broadly, a specific family or tribe of Nunahi more specifically, the Menehune specifically, your kingdom if you're in an anime, that sort of a thing. And for characters who are especially well-traveled, they might have more than one status. They have their primary alignment, but they have status with other groups. And membership in any group makes you, in the eyes of the dreaming, which is one of the ways we hand-wave things, but in the eyes of the dreaming, membership in that group, reflected by having status, makes you a part of that group, and it makes their magic affect you, unless you're using banality to resist it. But it gives you the benefits of membership as well as the drawbacks of membership, and the responsibilities of membership.
I really like that. The other thing I like about that sort of framework, and I was thinking about this a fair bit in the Turkish episode, is I don't love the idea of centralizing Arcadian society. I love the idea of fae stories that are broad and, say, I'm a house spirit. I will always be able to recognize other house spirits no matter where they're from. But if I'm from the Isles and I see I might recognize non-house spirits from the Isles because I'm from here, I've seen them. But a non-house spirit from Istanbul or from Africa, or even one that grew up and changed in America, I might see as Ghislaine. I might see as different. And the idea of having membership and status along multiple axes that you can purchase, that both comes with benefits, but also opens you up, doesn't necessarily make you vulnerable. I mean, it does make you vulnerable to groups of that affiliation, but also it'd be easier for them to heal you. It'd be easier for them to aid you. It just exposes you to them, and having multiple different axes that you could measure that against. Yeah, it's messy and it's complicated, and there's this big push to simplify right now, but I like that kind of nuance when it illuminates story dynamics, and I feel like this really does illuminate story dynamics.
All right, we talked a little bit about the Clurichaun, the Piskies, the Selkies, where they came from in the line, where they came from in storytelling, and where they are now in C20. We hope that you enjoyed this little episode, and we hope you'll join us for the next full conversation. The readings from this conversation were from American Gods by Neil Gaiman, Legendland being a collection of some of the old tales told in the western part of Britain served by the Great Western Railway, now retold by Lyonesse, and Selkie by Robin Robertson. The music from this conversation was LSD by Montplaisir and Late Snows of Winter, written by Mark Siebert and arranged and performed by JMR. Today's poorly explained echo. Well, of course we knot up the horse's hair. Nobody makes reins our size.